Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thank you so much for tuning in today for a little bit of Texas history. It is summertime in Texas with an exclamation point after it. The temperatures have been off the charts. I guess the older I get, the more I complain about the heat. It's everyone's favorite sport in Texas. But nevertheless, I hope you're enjoying some vacation time. I hope you're taking the time to get on a road trip, especially listeners with kids. Take them around the state and see some of our great historical sites. I already took a vacation to Colorado. I drove up there with a buddy of mine and stopped at the Charles Goodnight House in Goodnight, Texas. Highly recommend that. It was wonderful. You can see Paladar Canyon from there, and it's a really, really neat spot. They've done a great job with it. Something else we did on that Colorado trip, I've been going to Colorado for 40 plus years. Back in the day when the family would load up in the station wagon, we'd drive to Colorado. We would always stop in Amarillo and eat at the Big Texan Steak Ranch. It's an iconic Texas tourist spot, and it's hard to describe. You're just going to have to Google it and figure it out. But the thing that everybody remembers is the 72-ounce steak challenge, where you can sign up to eat a 72-ounce steak, shrimp cocktail, baked potato, some other things, a roll. I don't know. You got to eat it all in an hour, and if you do, you've won the challenge, and you don't have to pay for the meal. Let me just repeat that, 72 ounces. Well, my buddy and I were sitting there, and this dude got up on stage to do this, and, a lot of people try, but it's rare that you see anyone complete it. Not only did this guy complete it, he did it in 6.5 minutes, the second fastest time ever, and it just happened to be the night we were there. Really one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. The guy's name is James Webb. He's from Australia, and I looked him up, and recently in June, he also ate 59.5 glazed donuts in 8 minutes. So, this guy is amazing. So my friend and I decided that we had witnessed history. I've certainly never seen anything like it. Stay tuned for an interesting bonus episode maybe coming up around that. One of my favorite state historic sites is San Felipe de Austin. I've said that before. And I had the privilege of participating in one of their History at Night programs the other day, where I was interviewed by the site director, Brian McCauley, and we talked about lots of things around San Felipe and lots of topics. Had a full house, thanks to everyone listening who came out for History at Night at San Felipe. One of the things we mentioned was a murder in Kentucky and its eventual connection to the Republic of Texas. And it's an interesting enough case that I thought we'd talk about that today. So let's go back to 1836 and get wise about Texas. The subject of our story today is a guy named Issac Desha. He was born to Joseph and Margaret Desha. And I got to digress right away and tell you a little bit about Joseph Desha, because this is going to play into our story. Joseph Desha, Isaac's father, was born in Pennsylvania. His family moved to Kentucky, then they moved to Tennessee, then they moved back to Kentucky and settled finally in Mason County, Kentucky. Joseph built a house there. It's said to be the first brick house in the area. He was a farmer. And Joseph and Margaret eventually had 13 children. Joseph had fought in the early Indian Wars and was a major general in the Kentucky militia during the War of 1812. He also served in both the Senate and the House of Representatives for the state of Kentucky, and he served 6 terms in the United States Congress as a congressman from Kentucky. Finally, in 1824, he was elected governor of Kentucky. Now, in 1824, Kentucky was in bad financial shape. There had been what's referred to as the Panic of 1819. Gold and silver were withdrawn from circulation, replaced with paper currency, and it caused a lot of inflation and a lot of extravagant spending, and banks all over Kentucky failed, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly, if it was partly that panic that drove people south and played no small part in the growth not only of the South but also of the Republic of Texas. But that's a separate story. In any event, there was a great controversy in Kentucky as a result of that financial panic. The two political parties became the Relief Party and the Anti-Relief Party, and Joseph Desha was elected as part of the Relief Party. And I can't overstate how controversial this situation was, and whether the act was ruled constitutional or not was a huge political issue, and resulted actually in the creation of the purported repeal of the law that established the Kentucky Court of Appeals. And of course, this is near and dear to my heart, being on a Court of Appeals. And that law established a new Court of Appeals. So, and then the old Court of Appeals refused to acknowledge the legality of that. So they continued to sit. So you ended up with two courts of appeals and a bitter political struggle. And so Desha was caught up in the middle of that as governor. But nevertheless, one of his 13 children was Issac. Issac was educated and then apprenticed to a tanner. So he learned to be a tanner and set up his own tanning business called a tan yard. I don't know if it's pronounced that way or tanyard. So he was Issac the tanner. He married Cornelia Pickett in 1823. This is Issac now. And that was a union of the Desha and Pickett families, both prominent in the area. In the fall of 1824, a traveler came through the area named Francis Baker. Francis Baker was a lawyer by education, but ended up becoming a newspaper editor in Natchez, Mississippi. And he was traveling through this area of Kentucky on his way to New Jersey to get married to a woman to whom he had been engaged for some time. And so he was on his way and came through this Mason County, Kentucky area. He ended up catching a fever in Lexington, which is south of Mason County, and took 4 or 5 days to recover. He stopped in the Mason County area at a hotel where he proceeded to treat what was left of his fever with whiskey. Got up and rode about 5 miles further to a tavern owned by someone named Doggett. So he ate breakfast at the tavern, and one of the people there at breakfast was Issac Desha. So Baker decided, he announced that he wanted to visit a friend of his who lived in the area, and Desha said, "Oh yeah, I know that guy, and I'm riding that direction." So Baker and Desha set off about 8 in the morning, as far as we know. Baker had saddlebags with him, as you would expect if he's on his way to New Jersey. Desha left with him on a bay mare and carried what's described in the sources as a heavy loaded riding whip, which would have meant a whip with lead in the end of it. Later that morning, another resident of Mason County, a guy named Milton Ball, he saw a loose horse, an iron gray mare with saddle and bridle, headed up to a house. So he caught the mare and he rode back the direction the mare had come to see if he could find the rider, and he encountered another loose horse, a bay mare, which he immediately recognized as Issac Desha's horse. That mare was still saddled but had no bridle. Importantly, Ball noticed there was blood on the horse's neck and on the horse's withers, the shoulders up on above the front legs. He caught that horse and rode about a mile further, where he sees Issac Desha on foot carrying a pair of saddlebags on his arm. And at one point, Desha says, "Hey, I lost my wallet," or he called it his pocketbook. So they rode back and they found what Desha claimed to be his pocketbook, a red Moroccan leather pocketbook. In the meantime, several people had gathered at Desha's leather tanning shop, and Desha wasn't there. He shows up a little bit later, and he is now leading an iron gray mare. And Desha claims to the group assembled that he had just gotten this mare from a man to whom he had loaned some money, and the man just gave him the horse as payment. One of the men later commented to his spouse that Desha looked strange. He looked tired. He wasn't very chatty. His personality seemed to be different, and he thought there was some kind of trouble. Later in February, and I'm going to jump around in time a little bit, but it doesn't really matter. In February 1835, there are court records that Cornelia Desha actually married a preacher named Ricketts. Okay, so this is not that long after this incident. And Desha's wife was pregnant during this whole time. And some have written that she became so frightened by Isaac at this particular time that she left him at once and refused to live with him. So something obviously odd was going on. Let's go back to November when all of this transaction is happening. Two people are out hunting in the woods between two houses, one of whom belonged to Desha's father, Joseph, the governor. And in the brush, they found a pair of saddlebags. The saddlebags had been cut open at the bottom and were empty. So obviously they had been tossed into that brush. 2 days later, remember that bay mare didn't have a bridle on it? Two other people found Desha's bridle. Now, they knew it belonged to Desha, and they took it to a tavern and bought a bunch of drinks in exchange for the bridle, thinking Desha would come and redeem it and everybody would be happy. Another pair of people, actually there were three traveling, were hauling corn. Now, this is November the 8th. They're hauling corn, and they stopped near a place where someone, I don't have who, had found a blood-stained glove by the side of the road. And when they stopped there, they happened to notice about 40 or 50 yards off the road in a hollow was a body. They didn't touch the body, but they did report it. When a group of men went out there to investigate, they found a trail where the body had been dragged off the road, or what they thought was a trail, but they didn't find any blood or anything else. The body, however, was clothed only in a shirt, a vest, socks, and one glove. There were several wounds on the head wounds. The throat had been cut, and there were a couple of wounds on the body thought to be stab wounds. As they searched for further evidence, about a quarter mile from the body were found the man's pants and his coat. They summoned the man who Francis Baker said he wanted to visit, and he came and identified that corpse as that of Francis Baker of Natchez, Mississippi. A few days later, they started searching the area again for evidence. They found Baker's, the stuff he had packed. They found 8 shirts, 4 pairs of socks, another vest, and a bunch of other stuff in a hollow tree. So obviously it had been placed there by somebody. They also found a red Moroccan leather pocketbook under some driftwood. They pieced together fragments of paper, and the name of Baker was all over it. Interestingly, one of the men found some lead out of a riding whip in the road near where they had found Baker's body. A few days later, still searching for evidence, they found the cap of a whip as well as a hat. Well, who are you going to suspect? Well, how about the guy who had Baker's horse? So immediately everybody began to suspect Issac Desha, who had already been seen with Baker's saddlebags and that red Moroccan leather pocketbook. So a General Reed summoned Desha, and Reed was some kind of judge in the area because he ordered an examining trial to see if Desha would be held over for a murder trial. Desha cooperated. He came. He was kept in a house unguarded, not shackled at all. He wasn't put in any jail or anything. He was happy to stick around. But at the end of the trial, he was bound over for a regular murder trial, so they did put him in jail. He was indicted in December of that year. This is 1824 now. And indicted for the murder of Francis Baker. Now, this is a little interesting thing. To change the venue of the trial, which Desha's lawyer wanted to do, they had to file a bill in the legislature, which was done. Now, who signs the bills through the legislature? The governor and father of the defendant, Joseph Desha, the governor. So the governor signs the bill, and the venue is changed to a different area. So the trial is held in January 1825, and Issac Desha is convicted of the murder of Francis Baker. He is sentenced to death. Issac claimed he was innocent and that he had been conspired against by not only his enemies, but his father, Governor Joseph Desha's enemies. Then there was a motion for new trial, and one of the grounds for the motion for new trial is that the parties had talked to the jurors. Another ground was that the jurors had been threatened by Issac's friends not to return a guilty verdict, even though they did, and that they polled the jury, and one juror expressed that he did in fact have reasonable doubt as to the guilt, but voted to convict anyway. So the judge in February of 1835, or excuse me, I keep saying the wrong day, 1825, granted a new trial, and they held it a year later. It was basically the same evidence, and the jury returned the same verdict of guilty of murder. So Issac Desha's execution date was set for July 14th, 1826. Shortly before his execution date arrived, Desha tried to commit suicide. He cut his own throat with a razor. It did, in fact, sever his windpipe, and he was not expected to live. Well, remember, his father, Joseph, is still the governor, and governors have the power to pardon. His father had refused to pardon him before, but since his son was about to die, Governor Desha decided that he would issue a pardon for his son's murder conviction, which he did, which of course stirred up his political opponents to no end. In fact, if you read about this case, you will see some people actually wrote that Governor Desha was forced to resign, but he did not resign. He never did resign. Well, Desha didn't die. He healed up, although for the rest of his life he had to breathe through a metal tube that he would stick in his throat. Desha decided now would be a good time to get out of town. So he changed his name. He went from Issac Desha to John Parker, and he traveled down to New Orleans. While he was in New Orleans, he met a gentleman named Thomas Early. Early was from Ohio. He was on his way to Texas. He is said to have been carrying a considerable amount of money and was going to go into the horse and mule business. So he and the newly named Parker sailed to Galveston in April 1828, and they continued to the capital of Austin's colony, San Felipe de Austin. They continued on at some point, presumably for the horse and mule activity, to San Antonio. However, when John Parker / Issac Desha arrived in San Antonio, Thomas Early was not with him. Parker goes into an establishment and gambles away a considerable amount of money and decides to return to San Felipe. So he pairs up with 3 other people that are going to San Felipe. And remember, of course, at this time, it would have been safer and wiser to travel in groups. So the 4 of them strike out for San Felipe. Once back in San Felipe, people started to suspect Desha may have actually murdered Thomas Early. And a short while after that, there was another party coming back from San Antonio that had found some of Early's clothing. As people began searching, they found a skull, which they assumed, of course, to be Early's. A short while later, more searchers found bones. again, presuming them to be earlies. The alcalde at San Felipe at the time was a man named Thomas Marshall Duke. He was from Washington, Kentucky. And he decided that this was not John Parker. It was, in fact, Issac Desha. And here's a quote from a letter that Duke wrote about how he could have identified Desha. He could tell, quote, from his family resemblance and his breathing through a silver tube, close quote. Now, I don't know how many people back then were breathing through silver tubes, but it seems to me that Desha would have stood out long before now. Anyway, Duke was reasonably satisfied with his identification and had Parker arrested. Another former Kentuckian identified Desha, and finally Desha admitted that it was, in fact, that he was Issac Desha and not John Parker. Now, San Felipe didn't have a jail, so Noah Smithwick, the great memoirist, was called in. He was the blacksmith, and he was called in to put Desha in irons and chain him to a porch of one of the buildings. Now, and this is interesting. Smithwick had purchased a horse from a black mare in Gonzales, Texas, and when he rode that horse into San Felipe, people began to suspect Smithwick was up to no good, because that black horse was the same horse that Thomas Early had ridden out of San Felipe. So Smithwick was what's described in some articles as, quote, annoyed by this suspicion, close quote. So he made sure Desha's irons were escape-proof. Stephen Austin, of course, took note of this case and wrote a letter to his sister in which he pointed out that they had Issac Desha in irons, and said something like there is no doubt that he's guilty. Something, I don't have the letter in front of me, but something like that. So it was not looking good for old Issac. But he never saw the courthouse. On August the 13th, which was the day before his trial was supposed to start, Issac Desha died of a fever. Later, Duke, the alcalde, claimed that Desha had in fact confessed to him that he had murdered both Francis Baker and Thomas Early. But of course, no written confession exists. However, when you're affiliated with several horses belonging to men who disappeared under suspicious circumstances, at least in the early 19th century, you were in some kind of trouble. Issac B. Desha rests in the cemetery in San Felipe, the capital of Austin's colony, and thus ended another tale of murder in early Texas. Now we come to the part of the episode called Getting There, where I tell you where to see some of the places I described. Of course, San Felipe de Austin is on I-10 between Katy and Sealy, Texas. There's a prominent exit with a sign, San Felipe de Austin. Go north to the Brazos River, and you will be in the capital of Austin's colony. The Campo Santo, the cemetery, is still there. Unfortunately, the exact location of Issac Desha's grave, at least to me, is unknown. I haven't been able to find it, but that cemetery goes back to the 1820s, so that's not entirely unusual. In Mason County, Kentucky, if you're up that way, is on the Ohio River on the border with Ohio, southeast of Cincinnati, where you can go see where some of these events occurred. Well, that wraps it up for another episode of Wise About Texas. Thanks for listening today. Go find us on Twitter and Instagram at Wise About Texas. If you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, you can go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. Go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.